Welcome to the Page Turners podcast, and thank you for tuning in to our Beyond the Red Pen Editors Edition podcast with two amazing editors, Jennia and Sarah Jules. Now, if you've always been terrified of working with a professional editor like I have, then this show is for you. Good. All right. So we are live. Thank goodness for that. I was wondering for a moment whether or not I was going to get on there for a second. That's really good. Well, before we start then, so welcome to the show, everybody. This is our first live event, and I thought what better way to start the live than by having an editor's show. So we've got two fantastic editors on the screen, as you can see. I am not an editor, so I'm kind of looking at it from your perspective as well. Now, at the end of today's show, I've got a gift for you as a bit of a thank you, a giveaway really as a thank you for being here. And it would mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the channel. If you like what you see, click like and add a comment. That would be great. It'd be really helpful to us to reach other authors as well. Now, we are going to have a live Q&A session. We're going to do that at the end, but I have got some questions already from some people over on Instagram. Thank you guys for sending those over. A couple of which we're going to answer as we go through, but we will save a couple until the very end. So thanks again for sending those over. Now, before I introduce today's guests, what I'd like to do is, and they're going to give us a ton of priceless information today, by the way. So if you've got a pen and piece of paper, have that handy, I'm sure, to scribble some notes. But I'm going to put links to their websites and how you can get in contact with them, hopefully in the chat, and of course, in the description below this video once it's posted and finished on YouTube. So you'll be able to reach out to Sarah and Jennia quite easily at the end of it. But as I said, before we get started, what I'd like to do is to start off with some quotes from best-selling authors about editors and editing, and then I'll introduce you to our guest editors who we've got here today. So this first quote is from Stephen King, and he says, I'm going to read it so it's here. It says, "Only God gets it right first time, and only a slob says, oh, well, let it go. That's what copy editors are for." So that's Stephen King. That's his first one. Now, this next one is from Leah Del Rey. She's an international bestseller. And this is what she says about editing. She says, "Editing is like dieting, except a lot more violent." Wow, that kind of says it all about editing. So there's two really kind of that make you kind of think about editors. But these next two are much more positive. So this one is from Emma Hill. She's a writer, producer, and director. And she says, "The first draft is black and white. Editing gives the story color." And that's so true. It absolutely does. And the last one, this is from Ariel Levy. She's a New York Times best-selling author and a staff writer on The New Yorker. She says, "A real editor isn't just someone you work with. He's your guide." And that is so, so true. So let me welcome our guides for today. We've got Jennia with us, Jennia from Jennia Edits, and Sarah Jules from Sarah Jules Writing. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Same, thank you.
You're very welcome. I've been looking forward to doing this. It's going to be a really good, fun show, hopefully. And I'm sure you're going to guide us through this with tons of information. I've got some questions I'm going to ask you as I go through as well. But feel free, if I'm talking nonsense, to cut me off and jump in, and then we'll go for it from there. And as I said, we'll finish off with a Q&A. So, guys, if you've got a question for our editors, put it in the chat box, and then we'll go for it from there. Lara, thanks. Morning to you as well. Thanks for coming. So let's start off then with a bit of a negative one, first of all. So even though, right, that we know that editors are our saviors, and I know that for sure, that editors are our saviors, why do you think editors are afraid of giving their work to you guys? Why do you think that is? I can tell you what I think, but what do you think?
One of the comments that I've seen come up a lot is that they're afraid that their work is going to be taken or stolen in some way.
Oh, okay.
And that's not true. So we do have reputations to uphold, and all it would take is doing that even one time and trying to pass it off as our own, and we'd lose that. But also most editors, or the editors we were looking for, they should have a contract. Like my contract has a clause in it that says, I'm not going to be taking credit for your work. I'm not going to be sharing it. So I think that should alleviate that doubt.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
That's not something I'd thought about before, to be honest. That's really interesting. I think from my perspective, a lot of my clients are scared that they don't see their work as good enough
Yeah.
to give to an editor. They're not sure if it's worth the cost of being edited. They're not sure if, we're going to judge their writing, if we're going to judge the content. And it's not like that. We don't judge the content. We don't judge, anything, because everybody's got a different starting point, and maybe some just need a bit more polishing than others. Nobody's judging anybody, and most editors that I've spoken to are really lovely people. They are very supportive, and they will sort of coach you through it, and they will tell you what editing you need rather than sort of forcing you into all these little boxes. Will advise you on what works best. And most editors that I know are more than happy to just have a conversation with you before you commit to anything.
Welcome to the Page Turners podcast, and thank you for tuning in to our Beyond the Red Pen, the Editor's Edition podcast with two amazing editors, Jennia and Sarah Jules. Now, if you've always been terrified of working with a professional editor, this show is for you. All right. Yes, we are live.
It should be any second.
That's it. Good. All right. So we are live. Thank goodness for that. I was wondering for a moment whether or not I should get on there for a second. That's really good. Well, before we start then, so welcome to the show, everybody. This is our first live event, and I thought what better way to start the live than by having an editor's show. So we've got two fantastic editors on the screen, as you can see. I am not an editor, so I'm kind of looking at it from your perspective as well. Now, at the end of today's show, I've got a gift for you as a bit of a thank you, a giveaway really as a thank you for being here. And it would mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the channel. If you like what you see, click like and add a comment. That would be great. It'd be really helpful to us to reach other authors as well. Now, we are going to have a live Q&A session. We're going to do that at the end, but I have got some questions already from some people over on Instagram. Thank you guys for sending those over. A couple of which we're going to answer as we go through, but we will save a couple until the very end. So thanks again for sending those over. Now, before I introduce today's guests, what I'd like to do is, and they're going to give us a ton of priceless information today, by the way. So if you've got a pen and piece of paper, have that handy, I'm sure, to scribble some notes. But I'm going to put links to their websites and how you can get in contact with them, hopefully in the chat, and of course, in the description below this video once it's posted and finished on YouTube. So you'll be able to reach out to Sarah and Jennia quite easily at the end of it. But as I said, before we get started, what I'd like to do is to start off with some quotes from best-selling authors about editors and editing, and then I'll introduce you to our guest editors who we've got here today. So this first quote is from Stephen King, and he says, I'm going to read it so it's here. It says, "Only God gets it right first time, and only a slob says, oh, well, let it go. That's what copy editors are for." So that's Stephen King. That's his first one. Now, this next one is from Leah Del Rey. She's an international bestseller. And this is what she says about editing. She says, "Editing is like dieting, except a lot more violent." Wow, that kind of says it all about editing. So there's two really kind of that make you kind of think about editors. But these next two are much more positive. So this one is from Emma Hill. She's a writer, producer, and director. And she says, "The first draft is black and white. Editing gives the story color." And that's so true. It absolutely does. And the last one, this is from Ariel Levy. She's a New York Times best-selling author and a staff writer on The New Yorker. She says, "A real editor isn't just someone you work with. He's your guide." And that is so, so true. So let me welcome our guides for today. We've got Jennia with us, Jennia from Jennia Edits, and Sarah Jules from Sarah Jules Writing. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Same, thank you.
You're very welcome. I've been looking forward to doing this. It's going to be a really good, fun show, hopefully. And I'm sure you're going to guide us through this with tons of information. I've got some questions I'm going to ask you as I go through as well. But feel free, if I'm talking nonsense, to cut me off and jump in, and then we'll go for it from there. And as I said, we'll finish off with a Q&A. So, guys, if you've got a question for our editors, put it in the chat box, and then we'll go for it from there. Lara, thanks. Morning to you as well. Thanks for coming. So let's start off then with a bit of a negative one, first of all. So even though, right, that we know that editors are our saviors, and I know that for sure, that editors are our saviors, why do you think editors are afraid of giving their work to you guys? Why do you think that is? I can tell you what I think, but what do you think?
One of the comments that I've seen come up a lot is that they're afraid that their work is going to be taken or stolen in some way.
Oh, okay.
And that's not true. So we do have reputations to uphold, and all it would take is doing that even one time and trying to pass it off as our own, and we'd lose that. But also, most editors, or the editors we were looking for, they should have a contract. Like my contract has a clause in it that says, I'm not going to be taking credit for your work, I'm not going to be sharing it. So I think that should alleviate that doubt.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
That's not something I'd thought about before, to be honest. That's really interesting. I think from my perspective, a lot of my clients are scared that they don't see their work as good enough
Yeah.
to give to an editor. They're not sure if it's worth the cost of being edited. They're not sure if, we're going to judge their writing, if we're going to judge the content. And it's not like that. We don't judge the content, we don't judge anything, because everybody's got a different starting point, and maybe some just need a bit more polishing than others. Nobody's judging anybody, and most editors that I've spoken to are really lovely people. They are very supportive, and they will sort of coach you through it, and they will tell you what editing you need rather than sort of forcing you into all these little boxes. Will advise you on what works best. And most editors that I know are more than happy to just have a conversation with you before you commit to anything, obviously, so that if you want to give your baby to them to look after for a while.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that, and both of you really. But for me particularly, it is. I think as a writer, and even Stephen King still goes through this. He doesn't think that his writing or my writing is good enough, and to give is, as you said, your baby to somebody else. It's that feeling of, are you going to just tear it apart, and all of a sudden I'm going to feel like I'm this big, and that doesn't happen. And because quite honestly, neither of you look very scary to me.
Oh, good.
So I think we can dispel that immediately, and that we shouldn't. But there is always that fear, isn't there, that what we've written isn't going to go down well. It is poorly written, but then as the quote said, the first draft is always black and white, and you guys add the color to it, so you can tell us what we need to change, what needs to be improved, moved, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful way of doing it. So
I think there is also the fear. I think that what we hand back, people are going to think they're scared it's not going to be recognizable as their own work. They think we're going to take it and change everything. And sort of our job is just to make sure that their manuscript comes across in the best light possible. We're not going to put our own voice into it. We're not going to rip it apart. We're not going to bastardize it and make it something completely different. We just want it to be that we want their story, their work to just be shown in the best light possible. And a good editor, it won't be recognizable that they've had input at all, in theory.
Exactly. I think the fear of the feedback is also one of them too, just from people I've spoken to, because it's not even just, are they going to tell me that my work isn't publication ready, or any of these other fears that they might have, but it's the feedback itself. And I think that goes into almost that fear of rejection or being told we're not good enough. So it settles into that other fear and then trickles down into that other area. But again, an editor, especially one who's been trained, has learned how to be diplomatic in what they're giving you. They're not going to be brusque or harsh with their wording. Their job is really to guide you through this, not slam you into it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because again, I suppose really the question is then, how do you keep the writer's voice without, if you're not changing, or there are quite a lot of edits to do. How do you make sure that the writer, the manuscript keeps the writer's voice and doesn't overlay, you don't have yours overlaid onto it?
I think it depends on the type of editing as well. So copy editing is sort of editing for correctness. grammar, spelling, punctuation, things like that. Whereas line editing is perhaps a little bit more tricky in that regard, because line editing, you're looking at sentence level, making sure each sentence reads as clearly as possible. So copy editing, I don't think there's ever really much fear of it sounding like somebody else's work.
Right.
But line editing is a little bit trickier, because essentially that does come with some maybe rewriting suggestions and things like that. And I think it's just a case of being aware of it as you're going, and just making sure that your own voice, your own preferences as well, because people write in different ways, that's not clouding your judgment there.
You get a really solid feel for how someone writes, though, and even their word choice preferences and how they might phrase something, just by having that familiarity with their manuscript and reading it again. And I think that becomes even more true with authors you work with over time, over multiple projects. So you get to the point where you can really envision what they might have said there, what maybe they're trying to say and is not coming across. And that obviously is going to affect the quality of your suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm already relaxing now that you've told me what it's all about, which is really good. So the fear is dissipating, which is really good. So how do you then, I think we'll probably get into more detail about this when we get into the particular types of editing shortly, but how do you work with your writers in terms of communication? Are you, is it email, is it phone calls, is it Skype, is it Zoom like we are on now? How do you talk to your people?
Everything. A lot of it depends on what the author prefers. There are some who like to send their manuscript and then have not really any communication until it's sent back. And then there are others who like to check in, others who ask for a phone call because they don't want the back and forth of email, others who might want to do a Zoom meeting just to see me in person so it feels more like a conversation. And also if we want to utilize the screen share feature for whatever reason, like if there's a question that they have on a certain page and it's just easier to go through it together like that. So I just do whatever works best for them and whatever also makes the most sense for where we're at with the editing.
I can't say any more than that. Exactly. Different people like different things.
Yeah, that's
and
good. Yeah.
Whichever suits the person and the project the most.
Fantastic. And simple question, do you actually use a red pen?
No.
I just thought I'd ask. That's good. Okay, that's fine. So, do you find then when people contact you, writers particularly, that they are asking perhaps, and maybe misunderstanding the type of editing that they need?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
I
good.
mean,
Next
it's
question.
so confusing. It is so confusing. And like Jennia was saying before we went live, there's different people call it different things as well. Even within professional circles, people call it different things. So how on earth is a reader supposed to know what they need?
Well, yeah, I suppose. So, and I'm assuming then you just advise an author that you actually this is the type of editing that you need. So you just let them know.
I think an author comes to you with a vision of what they're expecting from you. Whether it needs just sort of editing for correctness, or whether they'd like something a bit more in depth, like a developmental edit or a line edit. We can go over what those are if you'd like.
Yeah. That's the next bit.
Well, and seeing a sample really helps too. So if they send you a sample, let's say one chapter, you get a feel, even if they haven't specified which type of editing they want, what really would be best for their manuscript, because even from that sample, you can pick up on things.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then really, I suppose let's talk about the different types of editing that there are. On my list, just here, got development editing, line editing, copy editing, and then do you include proofreading in that as an editing, or is that just an additional service?
I would class proofreading as sort of a separate entity on its own, because the proofreading comes after you've done everything else. The proofread is technically supposed to be the final read of a physical manuscript, so in book form or sort of printed off, just to check that there's no typos, no errors. That is technically what proofreading is supposed to be. But I think a lot of people, I think maybe Jennia might be the same, we do that on the computer now. We don't really see many physical copies of anything.
No, and proofreading seems to be what people ask for the most, which just adds to that level of showing that people aren't really certain about the different types of editing, because they might say they want to proofread, but really they want a line edit or a copy edit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. So when people send you, before we get into the types of editing there, just made me think of another question. When people get in touch with you and you agree to work together, how do they send you their manuscripts? Do they send you the whole thing as a, I don't know, PDF, printed copy, or do you prefer to get it in chapters so you can work over a period of time? How do you prefer to get it, and how do you get it?
So I almost always do developmental edits, and that does require the entire manuscript because I need to be able to see the story from start to finish in order to look for things like plot holes or a character arc, and if that character arc actually is finalized. And I can't do that chapter by chapter. And I would even say the same thing with a line edit, because there I'm going to be looking at word choice and things like even dialogue and is it realistic. And if a phrase is repeated from chapter to chapter, or even a character repeats that phrase from chapter to chapter, it's harder to pick it up if I'm looking at it piecemeal.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I mostly do sort of the copy editing side of things. I do quite a lot of developmental editing and line editing too, but for me it is mostly the copy editing. I don't think I've ever been asked to look at manuscript in parts. I will take sort of the first chapter to have a look at, like Jennia said, just to sort of see whether what the client's asking for is what they need. But yeah, a full manuscript, and for me it is usually in Microsoft Word. That's how I prefer to work. Some clients like to do it through Google Docs, but I find that to be quite sort of cumbersome because the client wants to be looking at what you're doing all the time, which I understand because that it's so exciting and nerve-wracking to have people looking at what you do. But for me, it is Microsoft Word, and it's normally emailed in case people want to ask, how I get the manuscript. It's normally through, you just email me a copy of the Word document.
Wow.
Same. And then
Okay.
Google Docs is harder to track the changes too.
Oh,
It's harder to see who has done what and what's been accepted. And then if you notice something is missing, it's harder to go back and say, well, did I make a comment here to do something here?
agreed.
But yeah, in Word, you can keep track of all of that.
Well, that's killed me. I do everything in Google Docs, so that's that's me finished. Okay, so interesting, Jenny. You were talking about character arcs and character development.
Mhm.
How do you deal with that if a character develops over a series, like a trilogy, for example? Because then, the character's journey hasn't completed until the third one. Is that
Right.
something that you need explained to you during an edit of maybe the first book, or is that a question that you would ask? Is this a series?
Yes, I do usually ask that because sometimes you'll see unfinished plot points and
Hmm.
you need to make sure that those are going to come up in a subsequent book, because we also want to make sure that those are also completed and not just left trailing and then never addressed again. And so I might ask the same thing with, like you said, a character and a character arc. We do want to see progress towards change,
Mhm.
but obviously we're not going to reach that final endpoint of the arc. But yeah, it is important to have at least a brief outline of what we can expect across that series.
Sure.
And I think clients do normally know in
Mhm.
advance if they're planning a series, and they would probably mention that to you, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had that happen too, where I've highlighted something and have said, is this foreshadowing for what's going to happen in the next book?
Mm.
And asking for more detail, because that also gives me an idea, is this something that we need to address here, or is this something that I need to leave in a note folder for later?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I ask is because it was something that J.K. Rowling said when she was being interviewed about it, that sometimes, an editor has gone back to her and said, well, this character isn't fully developed. You could do this, that, and the other. But in her mind, she knows full well that it's going to be dealt with over the next subsequent number of books, however many it's going to be. So she kind of digs her heels in a little bit. I think she does that quite a bit. But, that's maybe just something that I thought you guys probably come across that, and so you've answered that perfectly. Thank you.
But
So,
I do think that is the writer's sort of that's their choice as well. Anything that we say
Mhm.
is a suggestion at the end of the day. They don't have to take anything that we say and run with it. We're just coming from a place of we feel this would be best for the book. But obviously, at the end of the day, it's somebody else's manuscript. It's their book. It's their baby. What they do with it is on them.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well said, agree.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's talk about the types of editing then. Let's start with, I suppose the one at the very top is developmental editing. Uh,
Mhm.
so let's start there. Um, so when you're development editing, are you very much kind of a silent partner, do all the structural changes or structural suggested edits and give it back to the writer? Or are you more like a consultant where you're commenting and asking questions kind of as you're going through the developmental edit? So in other words, do you do it over as you read through and make the changes, or do you do all the changes and then hand it back?
I
I,
would say I'm more of a consultant. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
no, I agree. I would say that developmental editing for me, we don't really change anything in the document itself. It's more providing feedback. So if you have a developmental edit, don't expect it back proofread, copy edited. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking at the big picture, what works, what doesn't work, character arcs, where the plot points are missing, things that are strong, things that are weak, what the pace is like. So it will, for me, when I do a developmental edit, you get inline comments throughout with sort of things I'm thinking and feeling as I go. And then you get a report with sort of, it's like a school report, things that I think you did incredibly well, and then things that you might want to take another look at. Is that what you do, Jennia? You
Yes,
do
that's what I do as well. So sometimes I will make small copy edits in it, but it's just to improve the readability for myself,
Right.
just so I don't fixate on it. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I'll come back and it will have quite a few comments over in the margins, plus that editorial summary. And then those are my deliverables. And then they do whatever they're going to do and send it back to me for a second look.
Oh, fantastic. So that's the process then. Essentially, you read through, make comments, and as you said, Sarah, see how it feels to you. So, which I really like that because, writing is very much a kind of a sensory event rather than just sort of an academic writing event. It is, making your reader feel, which is fantastic. That's really good. So you make comments as you go through, and then a summary at the end, and then you expect, or not expect is perhaps not quite the right word, but authors often send it back to you with the edits made for you to read through again. So it's almost like an evolutionary process,
Yeah.
and you
Or
keep going back.
even they may sort of, sorry, they may like answer the suggestions that you put in. So if you put an inline comment and they know they've done it for a certain reason and they want to keep it that way, they might just respond to comments throughout if there's certain things that they didn't want to action. And then we would just go through and read the whole thing again just to make sure that the changes that they've made sort of align with what we were suggesting. And then they get another sort of feedback at
Mm,
the end.
mm.
Right, because they can also introduce new inconsistencies when they've changed it. For instance, I've seen where they scrap a scene, but then there's still mentions later of that scene having occurred. And obviously those don't fit anymore. Or maybe a character name has changed, or a character's even been deleted, and then that character original name or the now deleted character is still referenced. So things like that that we still have to look out for as well, in addition to do those changes do what we expected them to do.
Fantastic. So how do you keep track of all of this stuff then? I'm assuming that you have some kind of software, or I'm going to say Google spreadsheet because that's what I use.
I take a lot of notes.
Okay, yeah.
I'm the same. And so with Microsoft Word, you can flick on an option called track changes, and it sort of flashes up anything that you've changed in the document, and different people come up in different colors depending on who's changed it. And we would have the document that we delivered with all of our comments that we'd made anyway, so we can kind of match up to see whether they changed this bit throughout.
Wow.
And I'll sometimes have a document for myself where I leave comments in it, like double check that this happens, double check that so and so's, all these different little notes to myself, but it's a separate document.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Lara's just put a comment in, and she says, "Whenever I send my book back for round two, I'm always afraid I broke the book."
You
Yeah,
can't break a book. You
I
can't
suppose you.
possibly break a book.
Yeah, I suppose you can't. I mean, for me, I suppose the downside for me being a pantser, very much on the pantser end, is that sometimes if I've made edits and changes, then all of a sudden I go off on another tangent and I think, oh, the story could go there or I could go there. And then I'll write something else and they'll come back and go, no, go back to where it was before. It was fine. So I suppose in that respect, it could, as a pantser, I don't break the story, but I could change it. I don't know.
I would suggest also keeping copies of different versions of the document at every stage. So before you make the changes that you sent off for a developmental edit, keep the original and then keep another version and then keep another version. So if you change something and you think, oh, I shouldn't have done that, then you can always go back and you've already got the other version of it you've not rewritten over the top of it.
Oh, great idea. Like that. Yeah.
Another thing I do, especially if the plot is more complicated, and this is especially true for speculative fiction, I will make a brief chapter summary of what happens in each chapter and keep for myself too. That also helps ensure that there is consistency and that the plot stays focused.
Fantastic. I do that too. In Google Sheets. I'm going to keep referring to Google because this is the one that I use. But yeah, that's what I do. So and that's actually in the giveaway at the end. There's everything that I do in there, so you can see what I do exactly. But yes, that's something that I do as well. It's a lot of work, but I do find it, as you said, Jenny, really useful to make sure that you're on track, and it's easier to identify plot holes then as well.
And this is a little more old school, but I also do the post-it wall
where
I make timelines with different colored post-it notes depending on when these events are happening, especially if there's dual or triple timelines, and then separated by color based on POV. So I will have that sometimes up right over my desk so I can look to it and refer to it.
Wow. So you don't need wallpaper, you just got post-it notes. So that's great. All right, so let's move on then to, unless there's anything else you want to add about developmental editing.
Just that it also does look at all those, like Sarah was saying, the big picture pieces, but it isn't just character arcs and plot. We are also looking for plot holes, which a lot of people might miss just because they know what they're focused on. We're looking to make sure that that plot doesn't come across as contrived, too much coincidence, which can read as artificial for a reader. POV, head hopping, we make sure that's not happening. Goal motive conflict is another one that I pick up on a lot, where sometimes characters are doing something just to do it, and that too can feel contrived. So we're looking at all those other pieces as well.
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, developmental editing is really involved then, obviously, isn't it? I mean, you're into the story probably as much as the writer at some point, because you're having to follow and track and understand and sort of get into the writer's head, I suppose, to make sure they're on the right lines. That's quite something to do. Wow. So once you're a writer and you are happy with where the story is and it works and it fits and all that sort of stuff, so the developmental editing is done. Is it line editing next or copy editing?
Line.
Was that in stereo? Wow, that was really good. Line editing. Okay. So go through the line editing process with us then. So what is it and how do you do it?
Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Line editing is basically sort of sentence and paragraph level, making sure that everything reads clearly and in the best way possible. Because sometimes as a writer, and I do this myself, I know exactly what I meant to say, but that doesn't necessarily come across to the reader. So from an editing perspective, we're just making sure that your words say what you wanted them to say and in the best way possible.
Right. Wow, that's really interesting.
It's also looking at dialogue, so we're making sure that the dialogue sounds natural, and then also variance in dialogue between characters. So if you have, an 87-year-old man as one character and then a 10-year-old as another character, they shouldn't use the same phrases of speech and the same word choices. And sometimes also looking for just that variance in sentence structure too, since that leads to a more engaged reading experience.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay, that's really good. So I use a piece of software for when I'm sort of starting going through it called Pro Writing Aid. I don't know if you're aware of it, and Grammarly, of course, to kind of change some of they make suggestions now, don't they, with the types of words that they should put in, but they don't understand context. That's my experience of them. So do you find, and particularly in dialogue, actually, that the use of dialogue tags is overused, or they're just too many dialogue tags that people put in. So I often find that when I've read some other people's stuff that, you know, he said angrily. So they tell me that the person's angry as opposed to showing me in the dialogue. Does that come across a lot? Do you see that in line editing? And is that something you would change in line or suggest changes for in line editing?
I think so. Your brain, when you're reading a book, you automatically kind of glance over the word said. So, sort of, if you put so and so said and then somebody else said, your brain doesn't read said. It just, your brain goes, oh, that's who's saying that. So I think readers are so scared of just putting the word said that they end up with a massive string of words at the end that isn't necessarily like it's not important to the context. Whereas if you've kind of set that scene up well, and you can see from the action how the speaker is feeling, you don't necessarily need to put angrily. And I'm sure there's a Stephen King quote about getting rid of every single ly word in a manuscript.
Yeah.
He has the best quotes for everything.
Yeah, he really does, doesn't he? Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Jennia?
No, if I see too much of it, I'll definitely flag it. And it's just one of those things because it'll start drawing your attention to it.
Yeah.
And it's going back to that, how this affects the reader. As soon as they start noticing something, you've pulled them out of the story. And so repetition, especially with something like that starts bringing their attention to it, and we don't want that. But yeah, a lot of the time, those words like angrily, happily, we can convey those in other ways.
Yeah.
And part of that is just how do you get that across? What actions can you attribute to them? How, I mean, even facial expression, that sort of thing. And then, of course, it depends too on the genre you're writing in and just how far you can take that.
Yeah, I was going to ask then with the sort of based on what you've just said, do you find that people are using dialogue tags too much? Because sometimes I find it useful just to leave them off altogether, especially if there's just one, you know, back and forth between two characters. It's much easier just to leave them off. I will add one in to remind people, I suppose, who's talking, if you like, but I often leave them off altogether. Is that good or is that bad?
As long as
that's just your style.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you can tell who's speaking, it doesn't really matter. The only problem is if you go too far with it, you can start to suck the emotion out of it because people are just, it's just this rapid fire speech. And so it doesn't necessarily feel like a real moment because we don't know what else they're doing. And it's easy to picture one of those like talking head movies where it's just two people facing each other, rattling line after line.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, all right. So developmental editing then really is kind of like the consultancy, the commenting and querying. And then I suppose you could say that line editing is kind of the interior decorating. It's making everything look nice and really
like
nice.
That.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what it is. That's great. So let's move on then to copy editing. Presumably that's next. And I look at copy editing as just dusting the stuff off. So we're just dusting everything up now, making sure it's really good. So with copy editing, same question then really. What is it and how do you guys do it? Who wants to go first?
I'll go if you want. It's basically editing for correctness. It's grammar, spelling, punctuation. If you've sort of used single speech marks in one bit and double in another, it's sort of making sure everything's consistent throughout, and that it's basically if there's lots of differences in punctuation that you're using, then that again draws the reader out of the story. So it's basically just making sure everything's polished, everything's nice and neat, and that the punctuation aids the story rather than detracts from it.
And then also word choices too, because there are some words where you might spell them differently depending on your preference. So making sure it's always toward instead of towards or vice versa.
Yeah.
And that's an English and US thing as well, because we have different preferences and just making sure everything's like, if you've used it one way once, then that's what we do throughout.
Yeah. We could talk about differences like that all the way through. Like, and spelling, so that's another nightmare.
All those Zs.
All those Zs, my goodness me. Yeah, all the Zs, what's going on there? And other things like past and there, you know, the similarities in your and things like that should be picked up Is that sort of thing that you would pick up in copy editing, or is that more of a line editing thing?
Some people don't opt for a line edit. Not everybody needs a line edit
Okay.
necessarily. If it's just bits and pieces, that can get kind of dusted up in a copy edit.
Yeah.
But there, all those kind of things. Editing for correctness in that respect would normally come in a copy edit if it hasn't sort of been picked up in the process
Yeah.
beforehand.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So those are then the three main types of editing: developmental, line editing, and copy editing. And then we touched on proofreading earlier on. Do you guys do proofreading as well?
I do not.
I do.
All right. Okay.
Question's all yours then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So proofreading then is, I suppose, looking for those final mistakes. I mean, do you find many?
Surprisingly, yes. And so I am also a writer as well. And I embarrassingly find very few of my own mistakes in a proofread. I have an amazing proofreader who I use, and she embarrasses me every single time by finding things that I've missed in my own work. As an author, it's near impossible to proofread your own work because you know exactly what you meant to say, but you just might not have said it. So your brain reads it how you think you did it. So it's so hard to proofread your own work. And a great tip for authors, from my perspective, is Microsoft Word. It's the best invention ever. There is a read aloud function, so you can stick it on. It will read the document to you. So if there's a word that's certain words, stared and started, things like that, that your brain would gloss over, you will clock on that you've used the wrong word because Word is reading it to you rather than you sitting and reading it off a page. So read aloud is worth its weight in gold for authors at that stage, and I use that when I'm proofreading clients' work as well, because we're not perfect, and even bestsellers have typos in that their massive team of proofreaders have missed.
Yes.
Sort of technology like that really does help us to ensure that we don't miss things like that.
I suppose when we were all readers as well. So as a reader, and sometimes, as a writer, I'm reading through and I'm thinking, I'm going to find a mistake. I'm going to find a mistake. I'm going to find a mistake. And, I'm actively searching. And I read something online a couple of days ago from Turnerz, and I found 2 mistakes. And I thought, wow, this is, but you're quite right. I mean, the story was fabulous, absolutely brilliant. I was totally immersed in it. I loved the characters. Absolutely fantastic. And then I spotted these 2 areas, but then I thought, it doesn't matter, because I really enjoyed the story, and that was the most important thing for me. And I think you're right. It's never going to be absolutely perfect. I don't even think software picks everything up.
No, it doesn't. So they've done studies looking at the optimal level that people can work on. And this isn't talking about your daily work habits and what you can sustain over a period of time. And it was something like 94% was the ultimate level of, getting close to perfection that people clocked in at. But even when we look at software such as Grammarly and ProWriting Aid, they perform on the same level as a human editor.
Yeah.
And again, they are not able to do some of the editing that people will do, such as developmental editing, because they're not picking up on those clues and subtext and those bigger picture issues. And I think that one of the editing associations, an 80% percentage rate, is considered successful. And again, this just goes back to, we are human. We overlook certain things after we've also been over that document so many times. It starts to have that same effect that the author has, where now we are familiar with it, and we also know what it should be there because we've aligned ourselves with the author's vision by that point.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there should be errors. There should be little nuances in there that as give the manuscript, give the book color. Because we are human, we will enjoy it so much. How do you feel about AI then coming into the picture? I know I ask people about AI on my podcast, but and there's a kind of a mixed bag of emotions about it. But in terms of it, using it as an editorial tool, is it something that you think could help, or do you think that it still needs to have that human touch?
Are we talking Grammarly and things like that when you mean AI? Are you talking?
Yeah.
So things like that, Grammarly spell checks, I think they are useful. I admit to having Grammarly run down the side.
Me too.
But it has to be used in a certain way. Not all of the things it suggests are correct.
Mm.
Sometimes it suggests the most insane things. So you also have to have sort of the knowledge to go, that's not right, I'm not going to do that. But I think from an author's perspective, if they're getting their book ready to send to an editor, Grammarly, sort of spell checks, things like that are useful, but to maybe not think too deeply into things it's suggesting that you don't agree with, just gloss over it and keep going.
Agree. I've also seen some of these software programs completely change the meaning of a sentence because they'll come back with, we think you meant to say blah, blah, blah. And it's nothing at all what was meant to say. And then again, too, they don't pick up a lot on subtext or emotion. And so they can strip away some of these things that really made the story that story.
Yeah.
And then, too, their plagiarism checker. I've seen some really bizarre things come up in their plagiarism checker that have been reported to me by authors I work with that in no way should have come up because it's just a very basic phrase. But then they feel the need to take that phrase out all because of this software program.
Yeah, that's scary, isn't it? When something like that pops up, because we know as working online is that when the things are repeated and copied and plagiarized all over the place, you can get everything your business ruined effectively just by something as simple as that. But I think it is important just to make sure that you're not overly afraid of what you put out, and because you are creating something unique. It is your story, so how can it be plagiarized? Unless it is, of course. That's
Oh,
the
these phrases were so mundane. It was like, he wore a black t-shirt. And I mean, it was
right.
just
Yeah.
How dare you write that sentence?
Yeah.
yes, so many other people have written that line that you've obviously plagiarized this.
Absolutely. So do you find similar sort of mistakes all the time from writers? I mean, I'm sure there are many different mistakes that you see, but are there some very common ones that you see?
Yeah, so on a developmental level, I do often see the goal and the motive. They
Hmm.
aren't always as fleshed out as they could be. It's extremely common to see someone doing something again just to do it. But the reader wants to understand why they're doing it because without that, it doesn't really make sense. And they have no strong reason to continue going on this journey with the main character because, again, they don't understand why you're doing it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think so from a line editing perspective, it's people worry too much about making sentences fancy, using all these big words, words that don't necessarily fit in that sentence, just because you didn't want to use a word that you use in everyday life. And I just think when you think of storytelling, a reader doesn't want to be picking up a dictionary every
Mm.
page to figure out what something means. So sort of something I tend to pick up quite a lot on is sort of the tone of voice, and just because I do a lot of fiction, so just making it accessible to the reader. You're not writing an academic article, it doesn't need to sound particularly fancy. Just be authentic and say it in the way that is the most clear, rather than find this convoluted way to say something that you could have just said in a sentence, and instead it took a full page.
Right. So
Right.
essentially get to the point, cut the crap, just say it.
I think
Really.
a lot of editing is kind of cutting off the fat, just
Yeah.
things that are unnecessary, things that are too wordy, just making something twice as long than it needs to be. And as a reader, I'm often like, come on, just get to the point.
Yeah.
Like there's an art to it as well, we like beautiful writing and we like it to be poetic and fancy and lovely. But at the end of the day, readers are reading for the plot, they're reading for the characters, they're reading for the story. They would read poetry if they wanted it to be fancy.
That's a good point. Yeah. All right. So, big question now then. So, what is the benefit of hiring a professional editor like you guys? What are you going to do for the writer?
Well, I think we've both already have touched on this quite a bit, talking about we are sharpening your vision. We're not trampling all over it. We are making sure that it's going to hit the mark with the reader because we're not just doing this for you. We're also thinking about reader expectations and the enjoyability of reading this work because that is generally why someone is publishing whatever piece they're publishing. It's not just for their own self-indulgence.
Right.
Yeah. We want to make sure that what you put out there is in the best package it can be.
Mhm.
especially with sort of indie and self-publishing, there's a misconception that it's going to be full of errors, and people like me and Jennia are making sure that what's out there is in the best light possible. We're making your story look the best it can. You know, we don't want you to have feedback saying we found lots of typos, we found, you know, inconsistencies, the plot holes. We just want it to be the best it can.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Look, see, not scary at all. I'm quite
Well, and I think it's
confident.
important to note too that we bring a lot of industry knowledge and education into it.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
not just we are readers who enjoy reading and know how to pick up on these things. We've invested time and money into honing these skills,
Hmm.
and we've learned about what readers expect from different genres
Yeah.
and what the beats might be within those genres to make sure that those are present in your work.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, okay. So when someone's looking for an editor, then what should they look for in an editor?
My go-to would be sort of reviews. It would be looking at previous clients. Most editors will have kind of, you know, a file of feedback or something like that, or clients that can, you know, provide testimonials to attest to, you know, the quality of their work, that they know what they're doing. That's what I would look for.
I tend to not say to use testimonials because we're allowed to pick and choose which ones we post on our website. So obviously, we're not going to post anything that casts us in a negative light.
Hmm.
That is fair,
It's
yeah.
also easy enough to craft your own and attach a name to them. So unless you speak to that author yourself, it's hard to really back that up as being true or not.
Hmm.
If you're in a writing group already, you can ask those people if they have an editor, if they're happy with them, someone they recommend. Different writing associations will usually have a list of resources, and there usually also is some vetting that has to go into having a listing on there. So I would look there also. And then there must be an equivalent over there too. We have something here called the EFA. You can look in that directory. Again, there's not really vetting so much there, but it shows that these people are serious about their profession because they're willing to pay that fee and be invested and continue learning. So I think that's a good sign too. But also meet with that person because especially with Facebook groups now, there are so many scammers.
I was
Oh,
going to
yeah.
ask about that. So we'll
Yes.
yeah, let's talk about that really. So how can you avoid, because you're quite right, you know, I've seen it. How can you, what are the red flags? How do you know that this person that you've approached to potentially hire as your editor is really just going to rip you off? How do you know?
Well, one would be if they're posting all the time. So I would do a search for their name within the Facebook group because someone who's constantly posting about, I can help you, I'm here to do that for you, that's a red flag. Why
They're
don't
not
they have
busy.
work? Right, exactly. And then also, what are they really telling you when they say, I can help you? What information is that giving you about their skill set? Nothing.
Hmm.
When possible, and if the editor is open to it, I think that a phone call or a Zoom call really helps because it shows you that person really is who they're saying they are. And again, if you can find that person online in some way, so if they're presenting at conferences, if they're making themselves known as someone with a voice of authority within this business, that helps too. Because it's also going to be harder for someone to claim to have all this knowledge and then show up on a podcast and completely bomb.
Yeah, yeah. Sarah, same.
So I think for me, so my route into editing was a little bit different. So I sort of 6 years ago now, crazy. After I finished my master's degree, I wasn't exactly sure what to do. I found myself sort of leaning into sort of approaching editing, so I went through kind of a backwards route to do it. I didn't go to university specifically to do that. So I am sort of one of those people that I work through a website that's got quite a dicey reputation. So I work through the website Fiverr, but I am a Fiverr Pro seller. So that is vetted. So if you are looking for somebody through, I know a lot of indie authors go to websites like Fiverr, Readsy, Freelancer, places like that to find editors. In that regard, that is a great place to look at testimonials because they cannot be doctored, they can't be changed in any way. So you can look back through all the projects that the authors worked on, the writers, editors worked on. look for the sort of pro sections of those websites. If somebody is charging you something that seems very, very cheap, the chances are you're not going to get what you wanted out of that. So sort of if people are charging £15 for a full proofread, that's
Right.
not going to pick up on the errors that you're wanting it to pick up on.
Yeah, I've seen some scammers who do that too, where they'll charge really low rates and then the author reports they got it back and it's obviously just been run through Grammarly and then that's what they paid for.
Yeah, you do tend to get what you paid for in terms of editing. So I do think it's important to talk about websites like Fiverr because they do have not a very good reputation for things like that. But there are ways to use those websites safely and avoid kind of coming across as scammers. So look at reviews, look at the pro status, look at the qualifications because you have to list qualifications, things like that. And you can't go far wrong if you do it like that.
Yeah, I think you kind of sort of touched on another reason why people are almost afraid to go to editors because they're afraid of getting scammed. I mean, not necessarily me, but I know people who have spent a lot of money on marketing their books, for example. I know it's off topic, but the number of people I know have spent a lot of money on marketing and had got absolutely nothing, no value from it whatsoever. So I think that's great advice in terms of how you would kind of go and find a really good editor and those things to look at, really. That's really good. Thank you. So
I also say ask for a sample edit because you can't fake a sample edit.
no, right.
Even just a couple of pages, just so that, and also we might not align with your project. It might not be something that, we're interested in. It might not be our kind of speciality. I don't take on projects that aren't that don't align with what I want to be doing. So, it works both ways in that regard.
Excellent. So, okay, then. So I can kind of ask a question that Danny asked a moment ago, which kind of touched on what you just said there, Sarah. As an editor, do you stick to a specific genre?
I don't. I edit pretty much anything. As long as, I don't do anything that might be considered, taboo or offensive in any way. I'm more than happy to work on anything as long as, I get on with the client and I think I can help with the project and that it's even things like do our timelines match up because if I'm booked up then it's just not going to work and I'm not going to make promises that I can't keep. So yeah, any genre to answer that in the most long-winded way possible.
Jenny, what about you?
I also work on a wide variety, but I have a narrower view of what I will work on with a developmental edit. Again, because I need to have that understanding of the genre and the material. So I'll even apply to historical fiction. I do work on historical fiction, but there are some time periods and places I'm not as familiar with. So I'm not going to be as likely to pick up when something is off. And so those I won't work on, just as an example.
Yeah, so I suppose then the answer really is it's specific to developmental editing as opposed to copy editing and line editing, which is more technical, if you like.
Yeah, that's more for correctness, but I think that is a really good point, what Jennia said about in order to do a developmental edit, you have to be pretty well versed in the genre in order to understand whether it meets that expectation.
Yeah, so that would be another piece of advice then is to approach editors in your genre, I suppose. Yeah, absolutely. And Lara just said, of course, word of mouth is always and probably the best form of advertising anyway, isn't it, really? So if you know an editor that you've used and you've had a really good experience, then you're going to tell everybody else about it.
Yeah.
Can't say.
I actually had one author say that they don't share my name because they don't want me to ever be booked up when they need me.
Oh.
Wow.
Which is really flattering.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So let's touch on this was something, Sarah, that you mentioned earlier on, actually in the emails that we've been going backwards and forth. And this is a kind of very specific question: is what advice would you give to authors on a budget? Because let's deal with the elephant in the room. Editing can be quite expensive.
At the very least, from my perspective, at the very least, you need to have had a book proofread before it goes out into the world. If you can only afford one thing, in my mind, it's a proofread.
Okay.
However, if you did need copy editors on a budget, a lot of them will offer payment plans, things like that,
Oh.
and you can opt for people that are newer to the editing space in order to get it a little bit cheaper. But as a reader, you don't want to pick a book that's full of errors. Nobody's going to want to read. It takes you out of the story. So at the very least, it needs to have just been proofread.
See,
Best,
I would have said developmental edit, and
would
that's not
you?
a self-serving answer, but because we have to feel engaged with the story, we have to want to read it. That compulsion to finish it has to be there, and we don't really touch on that with a proofread. And so, like, even if you look at book reviews, a lot of books that might not have that same quality copy editing that we would expect from like a traditional publisher, they're still getting good reviews because it's based on the story. It's not based on the technical aspect that they're looking at on the written page. But
That's
that's
really interesting.
so there are cheaper options for that too. The number one that I can think of is a manuscript evaluation, which tends to be much more affordable because then you're not really getting anything on the document itself. You're getting basically just that editorial summary sent back to you.
Hmm.
So you might not have that same experience with, I know exactly what they're talking about and where to do this. And here's another line I should probably cut because it makes this character act like they're acting in a contradictory way. But you still get a better idea of what you might not have known ahead of time. And so those are generally much cheaper. But also, if you have a lot of really good critique partners, you can send it to your critique partners and ask for that same sort of feedback. And that still gives you at least a little bit of a leg up.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as a writer, it is for me. It is the story. Does the story work? Are my readers going to care about the story? Care about the characters? Are they going to want to follow this character along on their journey? So I suppose you're right. The proofreading, developmental editing is a bit of a crossover there, really. I suppose with all of that, in as much that you're kind of getting similar feedback from both. Although with developmental editing, you're probably going to get a lot more detail than proofreading. Um, but as a writer,
Proofreading, you wouldn't have feedback. It would just be sort of fixing errors.
right, of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose then really I would be more inclined to look at the developmental editing side of things. But is that the more expensive out of line editing and copy editing?
It can be, yeah. It's going to just also depend upon the editor. So my rates for developmental editing are not vastly different from what I would charge for line editing.
Mm.
Because when I'm looking at a project, I'm looking at first the complexity of the manuscript, the story, but I'm also looking at the strength of the writing, and then also just how much time I anticipate it's going to take. So the EFA put out a chart, well, they put out a chart frequently that shows how many pages per hour on average an editor can complete.
Mm.
And it is on the lower end for developmental edit compared to other kinds of editing,
Right.
simply because you're taking in and absorbing so much information and then letting it percolate so you can give those suggestions and recommendations. But I find that a lot of that time is not really spent at the computer so much as when I'm just doing the dishes or going on a long drive and that story is still just spinning in my head as I'm thinking through things. And I don't charge for the time when I'm, gardening and thinking of this story.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, and actually, I know we were talking about doing Q&A at the end, but Lara's just put a question in. What's the average turnaround time for a proofread of a 90 to 100,000 word book?
It would depend sort of on the editor's diary for starters. For me, I would say it's so hard to gauge because I don't know the quality of the manuscript. I would say sort of if it's the actual final proofread, genuine final, I would say sort of 14 days turnaround. That is once started. So, if diaries get booked up a few months in advance, things like that, that will change. However, sort of if it does need a little bit more editing than the final proofread, then it turns into a copy edit, and that can take months to do.
Wow. Okay. Jennia, same. How long?
For a developmental edit, I would say at least 1 month. Again, it depends on the quality of the manuscript and then also the word count, the complexity of the world building, if there is world building,
Mhm.
because then trying to keep track of all those different things adds into it as well.
Yeah. And she added a follow-on question. Thanks, Laura, for these, by the way. If you when wanting a proofreader for a sequel novel, do you need to have read the first one?
Not for a final proofread, because you are basically just looking at correctness at that point.
Hmm.
From a copy editing perspective, it would be useful to have read the first one. You don't need to have, it doesn't need to be something that I have copy edited the first one, but I need to have sort of had the time to read the first one, and then that would factor into sort of my rates that I would charge
Right.
for something like that, just the reading time.
Hmm. Yeah. So is that the same for you, Jenny? That's what you would do too?
Oh, right. Yeah. For a developmental and a line edit, it's really necessary because I need to be able to understand what's happened before then, who these
Right.
characters are, what this plot is like.
Hmm.
And it's almost like starting from scratch because I do need to make chapter summaries and so on for that first book or second book or whatever it is, because I have to make sure that that all follows through in the next installment.
That's kind of what we were saying earlier on, really, wasn't it? About, if you're writing in a series, that you need to
Mhm.
be able to see plot the story, really, I suppose, and see where it's going. That's great. So, Danny's asked as well. He was given two quotes: by page versus by number of words. What is more? What is the more common approach?
By
I
word.
would say, yeah, word count.
Okay.
You don't know
Yeah,
how many words will be on a page. It can differ so greatly that there's really no way of understanding how long that page is going to take you. But a lot of skilled editors who've been at it a while, they know better, per word, how many words they're going to get through in a day or in an hour or whatever it is. But
Yeah.
again, yeah, page is just too vague.
yeah, it could be the line spacing could be different. It could be a tiny font. I when I charge per 1,000 words, and I sort of round to the 1,000 words.
That's great.
So that
Otherwise,
is
I'd
how I
write it.
would do it.
Yeah.
Personally.
Otherwise, I'd write it in 4 point and send it to you as a
Exactly. No, that's
microphone.
what somebody could do.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's great. All right, so before we get into the last kind of part of it, which is going to be the Q&A, this was something, Jennia, that you mentioned again when we were talking off camera and in emails before we started today, is that you guys do more than just editing manuscripts. How else can you help authors?
Well, so I brought up one with the manuscript evaluation. There are also editors who will do beta reads. So if you would like a beta reader who has, again, all that industry knowledge and education, you can sometimes hire an editor to do one. And then we also help with query materials. So if you have your manuscript ready and you'd like to start sending it out to agents or acquisitions editors, we can go over all those materials with you.
Mm. Are you the
And then
same?
for
Same.
picture books, I also
I
do illustration ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Forgot.
I wouldn't. I tend to steer clear of helping with sort of the agent side of things and the querying, just because that's not where my experience is. I wouldn't feel comfortable charging for that. But I do know, like Jenny, there are people that can offer that. And I think that is amazing, because I don't know if you've ever tried to query it. It is a minefield.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know there's some authors that I've spoken to, have indie authors, who are looking to query agents. I can imagine that's some of it. It's not something I've done this time round, but I may, when I start writing in a different genre, is to sort of try that route as well, the traditional publishing route, and see what happens. Lara, sorry, has just put in as well. Jenny, she's worked with you twice now.
Oh,
Yes.
She has said that you have turned her, or you are turned into my emotional support editor. So, well, that's really important though,
Thank
as well, isn't it? Because you've got to, I think, feel like the editor that you're working with is on your side.
Mhm.
Rather than just someone who's browbeating you with, don't read it, don't write it like that, write it like this. You don't want someone like that. You want someone who's there to support you, because writing is an emotional journey. It's an art form, you know?
it's so personal as well. It's like sharing
Yeah.
your diary with somebody. You need to
Yeah,
feel comfortable working with them.
yeah.
Um, and there's ways to say things in like a critical way, but that's helpful and supportive. It's not a case of just, like you say, beating somebody down into submission until they do everything that you say. It's not
Right.
about that. We don't do that. And if an editor sort of, if you ever feel kind of pressured or coerced into doing something that you don't want to do to a manuscript, then maybe that's not an editor to work with again.
I'd go so far as to say that's another red flag.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh well, listen, that's great. I mean, I've learned a load just listening to you. Thank you very much for that. So I want to finish off now with the Q&A, really. And we've just got a couple of questions that I want to ask you. This one's from Catherine Kemp. This is somebody I had on my podcast, and she has asked, "What's a deal breaker when you're working with someone?"
Mm.
Oh,
Inability to take feedback is probably number one.
yeah.
You don't want someone who's going to fight you every single step and ask you to pull out the Chicago Manual of Style and point to that exact rule and explain why, or back up why you think that my character is being inconsistent here and elaborate on that for
Mm.
hours. But yeah, that's the number one, just because it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be emotionally draining. And I think it's important to think about the mental load that goes along with that, apart from just the physical hours working.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes it a negative process rather than being something that's supposed to be positive. I think for me, sort of, I've only ever fired a couple of clients. I tend not to, I'm that picky about projects that I work on now that my clients are incredible. And sort of for me, it's some people feel like because they're paying me to do something that they are in charge of every single thing that I do.
Mm.
There's there's ways to speak to people, and if I feel that I'm not being respected, then
Mhm.
that's a relationship that I don't want to continue.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely. You've got to be happy with on both sides, haven't you, really? Because you are working with somebody as opposed to for somebody, I would imagine, in most cases.
Oh
You
yeah.
Mhm.
Lara's hired you twice, Jennia, so you're doing something right. So I think it's really important to have that relationship. You've got to have that. That's great. Thank you. So the next one, then, this one's from Susie, another lady I had on my podcast. She has asked, what makes you want to work on a particular book? Is there anything that makes you go, I need to do that?
Oh,
For
some of it's
me,
just, oh, go ahead.
no, you go. I wasn't sure if you were going.
It might even be personal preference when it comes to tropes or different types of genres. But I mean, also part of it can just be that author. You might have had a really positive experience before and you look forward to working with them again and again.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think for me it comes down a lot of it to sort of the vibes that you feel from somebody, but you can kind of tell immediately whether that's going to be a positive working relationship. But sort of from the first couple of pages or the author's sort of brief overview of the book that they sort of send to you, you can tell whether, you're going to be excited about a project. And from an editing perspective, if we're excited about a project, that's when you're going to get our best work.
Yeah, completely agree.
Fantastic. Right. So let's finish on this last one. This is one from Simon. This is the controversial stylistic question. So is it, what is it? I can't even read that now. Do you remember what the question was?
Oh, was it the colon or
That's it.
semicolon?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, and then
I
the
can't
M
see
dash
that.
and the N dash. Yeah.
Yeah. Go on then. So what is it? I mean, that's Jenny, you mentioned that is a big question. So can you kind of break it down or sort of summarize it as much as you can in this short next few minutes?
So for
Go ahead,
me, yeah,
Sarah.
so a colon tends to come before you list something.
Yeah.
A semicolon separates two clauses. So it's kind of if one clause could be read completely alone, then you would use a semicolon instead of a comma. It's
Right.
if in doubt, don't bother. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
colons for lists, semicolons for separating clauses.
Right.
As far as unless Jennia has something different,
You
that's what
can
I would do.
sometimes, yeah, you can sometimes use a colon the same way that you would with an M dash, but you also see the colon more in formal writing or nonfiction than fiction. And
Mhm.
then you'll see the M dash in its place instead, usually in fiction. So part of that will be like, an aside or something you could have put within parentheses.
Yeah.
And then
Right.
the N dash is for ranges of numbers.
Okay, so all right, so that kind of makes it a little bit easier then to put because as we said, it is an art form, and I think really as an art form we should be allowed to break the rules every now and again. Would you agree with
You
that?
have you have to know the rules in order to break them.
Ah,
I think
good
that's
point.
that's the best way
Point.
to think about it. As long as you know why you've done something, then go for it.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely great point to make. Well, look, listen, thank you so much for coming today. I mean, we've gone over the hour now, which is great. Lots of really fantastic information there. Thank you so much for coming and answering all of those questions and telling us what editing is all about. And that you guys are not really that scary, are you?
I don't think so.
No.
No, thank you for having us though.
Yes,
It's been
thank you.
lovely to meet Jennia as well. It's been a really good experience. Thank you.
That's good. That's good. Oh,
Yeah.
and so Sasha has just popped up on. We're going to finish on with Sasha then. How do you switch modes to get into the different types of editing?
Don't know. I think you just do. You sort of go into it with a different mindset of what you're supposed to be doing
Right.
with the manuscript.
It's no different than at school where you had to switch classes and go from English to math. It's really just that same kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a good question though.
Yeah. All right. Listen, again, thank you so much for coming today. And don't run away. I'm going to stop the live stream in a moment. And I'm sure we could have gone on for a lot longer with a load more questions and a load more information, I'm sure. So we may well come back and repeat this. And as I said, thanks everybody for coming and watching today's show. If you could drop a like, subscribe to our channel, make a comment, that'd be great. We'll be able to reach out for more authors. I have put in the chat then the links then to Jennia and Sarah's websites. They're on there as well. Now, this has been recorded and it will be on the Page Turnerz website on the podcast page as well. So you can get back and get in touch. And don't forget, you know, you've got Jennia and Sarah's websites there. If you need to contact them, if you want to email them, if you've got other questions, feel free. That's what they're there for. All right.
Oh yeah, we're happy. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of both of us, but I'm sure Jennia feels exactly the same. We are happy to answer questions. If you don't know what sort of editing you need,
Yeah.
then that is what we're there for. We don't expect you to know exactly what you want when you come to us.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's like going to a mechanic, you know, we're trusting them
Exactly.
to tell us.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. We're going to leave it there and come and join us on Page Turnerz again. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.
Thank you.